Welcome to World War One, the war to end all wars. Today's focus is going to be on causes of World War One and the European focus. World War One got the nickname the war to end all wars because, of course, the hope was that this would be the final major war between all of these nations. Of course, we unfortunately know that it was not. So let's look at some of the causes. The first one would be nationalism. Now, we learned nationalism when we were talking about the causes of the Civil War as putting your region above that of the nation. Well, now the focus of nationalism is putting national interest and national unity ahead of global cooperation in foreign affairs. So you're putting your nation before the world. Sometimes this is necessary for the preservation of your nation, but sometimes it actually can end up hurting global affairs and get you drawn into a greater war. France and Germany were lobbying for dominance. Part of this was a naval dominance. Part of this was just to be the strongest nation in Europe. And then Russia and Austria-Hungary were lobbying for Serbia. Both were looking to control Slavic nations. So if we look at this map, you can see what the Europe looked like in 1914 before the war started. You can see a number of nations that don't exist today and also some nations that will lose territory because of World War I. Another cause was militarism, and this is the development of the armed forces and their use as a tool of diplomacy. The idea being that if you don't give us what we want, we're going to bomb you. It's sort of that idea. So Germany was the strongest military nation, but the British and German Navy were sort of vying for dominance in the Atlantic Ocean. Remember, Britain is one of the strongest navies or strongest nations in the world, and so their navy is going to be in competition with the German Navy. Alliances that existed during this time. The Allies were France, Great Britain, and Russia. The Central Powers, or the Triple Alliance, were Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then Italy. Now, Italy is our fair-weathered friend. First, they start on the side of the Central Powers, but later they'll join the Allies. When they join the Allies, the Ottoman Empire will join the Central Powers. One of the big causes was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir to the Austrian-Hungarian throne, and he and his wife were shot during a parade by Serbian nationalists. Now, he was not shot by the Serbian nation, but rather by an individual. But Austria-Hungary will declare war on Serbia. They expected this war to be short and brief. And they thought, this is a tiny nation, we're going to take him over very, very quickly. However, there's a domino effect of alliances. So let's look at some of those alliances. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Well, Serbia's first supporter is going to be Russia. Germany was the first to protect Austria-Hungary from Russia, so they declared war on Russia. And then they're going to declare war on France because France was Russia's ally. So then Great Britain gets involved as France's ally. And so later they're going to declare war on Germany. Now you see a variety of nations involved. Now Italy, our fair-weathered friend, they're first going to declare war on Great Britain, France, and Russia. But later, as they start to see the tide turning, they're actually going to declare war on Germany and become part of the Allies. If you're a little confused about this domino effect of alliances, you should be, okay? Because of this, we end up with all of these nations engaged in combat. Now remember, one of the things that George Washington told us in his farewell address is don't engage in the affairs of Europe. Don't make alliances with foreign nations. This right here, that's exactly why he told us to do this. So let's look at the type of warfare that took place during World War I. A lot of this should be a review from last year. The first one's trench warfare. Trenches in which armies sat and fought over no man's land. So you can see here them in their trenches and some of the men about to venture over no man's land. Every once in a while, the men would climb out of the trenches and try to overrun enemy lines. Machine gun and poisonous gas would attack the men. And so most men will end up dying in no man's land. When we look at the casualties because of this, one example is the First Battle of Somme, July 1st, 1916 until mid-November. The British are going to lose 60,000 men on the first day. Final casualties were 1.2 million. 650,000 Germans, 420,000 British, and 200,000 French. Only 7 miles will change hands. So if you look at trench warfare, it is very, very slow progress with incredibly high casualty rates. And as you guys know from World II class, that's because they have all this new technology, and yet at the same time they're fighting a conventional warfare based on old strategies. So let's look at some of those new technologies, these new weapons. We have Big Bertha, which was an 1,800-pound shell that could travel 75 miles. Unfortunately, Big Bertha could only be transported by railroad, which meant there was limits to where you could use her. The Zeppelin was a gas-filled airship that allowed Germans to drop bombs on English coastal towns. Now, a Zeppelin was highly susceptible to explosion, but how do you get bombs up there? And then you have the machine gun, 600 rounds of ammunition per minute, which means that you could just spray the enemy with bullets, which is great if you're defending, really bad if you're attacking. Some other poisonous gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas, etc. The thing about these gases is they're low-lying. They're heavy. So if you have a poisonous gas explode, they're going to go into the trenches. So if you have men down in the trenches, hunkering down, and you throw poison gas in there, they're going to stand up in order to get away from the poisonous gas, and you can shoot them. Mechanized warfare, which relies on engines that require gas or diesel. So we're going to have our first jeeps, we're going to have our first tanks, we're going to have airplanes, all relying on this mechanized warfare. The tank, as I said, built of steel, bullets bounce off of them. It was a British invention. However, the first tanks did go so slowly that it was very easy to run up to them rather than just relying on them to take you out. And then the airplane. Now remember, the Wright brothers had their first flight only about 10 years before this. And now the airplane is being used for reconnaissance and eventually a little bit in fighting. So it's amazing how this technology has advanced. So the British are going to, remember their strong navy, they're going to set up a blockade. The naval blockade was to try to prevent contraband, weapons, military supplies, and food from getting to Germany. American ships taking goods to Germany didn't challenge the blockade. So the Germans couldn't import food or fertilizer, and they couldn't grow any food. This meant 750,000 Germans are going to die of starvation. So German U-boats are going to respond. All ships headed towards Great Britain were considered contraband. Propaganda made it worse than had been. Only 75,000 died from submarine warfare. Now, I know what you're thinking. 75,000 is a lot of people. Right. But when you talk about 750,000 dying just of starvation because they can't grow food, 75,000 is a smaller number in comparison. The most significant one that we know of is the Lusitania. About 1,200 people died, 128 Americans. The Lusitania was sunk in 1914. We're not going to get involved in the war until 1917. So it's not a direct cause. But it does start to ask the question, how can Americans stay out of a war when Americans are dying from the war? Now, in March 24th, 1916, the French Sussex was torpedoed. 4 Americans were killed. So the U.S. warned Germany that it would break off relations. And with the Sussex Pledge, Germans said they wouldn't fire without warning. Americans decided to remain neutral. There was some opposition to this. They said, look, those opposed to going to the war said, it's not a threat. If they're 3,000 miles away, they're not going to touch our shores. It's an imperialistic struggle. Look at all those imperial nations. We're not imperialistic. I know, we just finished a unit on imperialism, but we were idealistic. And we didn't want Americans to experience the horrors of war. The stories coming back from trench warfare made Americans very opposed to getting involved in this. But there was some sympathy. We saw Germans as the aggressors. We had economic ties that were stronger with the Allies than the Central Powers. In 1916, we're going to have an election. Wilson is going to run as the Democrat. Remember, he has already been president for 4 years. He's running for re-election. And he's running on the platform, he kept us out of war. He's going to go up against a guy named Charles Evans Hughes. He's a Republican, a Supreme Court justice, and he wants to uphold America's right to freedom of the seas. Now, Wilson will win this war. He will win the war too. But he will win this election. Very narrowly if you look at the popular vote. But the biggest thing is that he is going to run on the platform of keeping us out of the war and remaining neutral. But you notice the year, 1916. I told you we got involved in the war in 1917. He is going to keep us out of the war long enough for inauguration, and then he will feel forced to declare war on Germany. That will be next time in our next lecture. Thank you.